Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, Consul 217 BCE. Arguably the most overlooked and forgotten senior Roman official from the Second Punic War, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus served Rome with honor even if he failed to win distinction. In the wake of the catastrophe at Lake Trasimene, it was Geminus's army which served as the main force of Fabius Maximus and the backbone of the massive consular army of 216. After some mixed service at sea, and some solid service on land in his waning months as consul, Geminus then met his end at Cannae, commanding the Roman center. Here is the story of quite possibly the most average Roman consul from the entire history of the Roman Republic. Let us begin by considering Geminus's place in the Roman social order. He was a scion of the gens Servilia, an ancient and well-represented Roman patrician gens. While the Servilii were not necessarily the most senior of the patricians in terms of being able to date their origins to Rome's foundation, they had been in the city for centuries by the time that Geminus was born. Gens Servilia was imported from the city of Alba and enrolled as patrician by the king Tullus Hostilius. In the monarchical period, it's possible that they were regarded as a minor patrician family, but it's clear that by the time you get to the early Republic, the gens Servilia was quite well regarded, and if anything, if you look at the Fasti, which is a list of Rome's consuls for every year of the Republic through the Empire, we see that people named Servilius were very well served by Rome. The family's particular object of worship, their sacra, was a copper coin. This copper coin would change in size depending on their status at any given time. I imagine that by the time of Geminus, this coin was not as big as it had been in the early Republic, assuming that that tradition went all the way back to the early Republic or even earlier. There were ultimately 12 branches of the gens Servilia, 4 of which remained patrician throughout the family's existence. Just to show you how long-lived this particular branch was, the last of the Servilii to hold the office of consul was Quintus Servilius Silanus, who served in that office in the year 189 CE. So, not long before the reign of Septimius Severus. This would put him in the reign of Domitian. So, this gens lasted from the foundation of the Republic to the end of the Flavian dynasty, which I think makes it the most long-lived of any gens in Roman history, but I could be wrong about that. Of all the branches of the Servilii, the Gemini are the most interesting because we know that they were originally patrician, but then became plebeian. I had to do a fair amount of digging to figure out whether Gnaeus was himself a patrician or a plebeian. Here's what I found. The Gemini branch may have originated around the year 300 BCE, so it was relatively recent, and in the time of Geminus himself, it was quite recent. Publius Servilius Geminus, who was consul in 252 and again in 248, was most likely Gnaeus Servilius Geminus' father, although it's possible that he was a grandfather. I'm guessing more likely it was his father, but not entirely clear. Gnaeus had a brother named Gaius, and it was either Gaius or his son and namesake who decided to make the Servilii plebeian rather than patrician. By this point, Gnaeus was dead, for reasons we'll get into that you can probably already predict, and it appears that either Gnaeus had no children or that they too died in the Second Punic War. Gnaeus' nephew Gaius Servilius Geminus became consul in 203, then served as dictator in 202, becoming the last dictator until Sulla, and he then served as Pontifex Maximus from 183 until his death in 180. I would have not spoken about him so much in this video, but I don't plan on making a video about him because aside from these impressive accomplishments, there's not a lot of specific information and there'd be no way to make a dedicated video. Nonetheless, I do think it's safe to say that our Gnaeus from this video was surpassed by his nephew. That being said, Gnaeus is much better represented in the historiographical tradition in terms of what he actually did, so we're talking about him and not his nephew. We don't really know anything about the early life or early offices of Gnaeus Servilius Geminus. So let us start by establishing the context of 217 BCE, the year that he became consul. The previous year, 218, was the first year of the Second Punic War, and that year Rome had planned to send one consul to Spain to fight Hannibal, and the other consul to Africa to put pressure on Carthage itself. However, all of that had been thrown into disarray by Hannibal's bold and successful decision to invade Italy across the Alps. This had led to two battles in northern Italy, Ticinus and the Trebia, both of which were won by Hannibal. This resulted in the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio being wounded and then being put out of action for the rest of the year. His colleague Tiberius Sempronius Longus was heavily defeated at the Trebia in a way which was actually damaging to Rome and sent some shockwaves. The Romans were not expecting Hannibal to be able to recover from his march across the Alps that quickly and then inflict a fairly serious defeat. Polybius tells us that Longus was eager to try to cover up the extent of his defeat and that the election was over by the time the truth came out. So when the Roman people elected Geminus and his colleague Flaminius, they didn't know the extent of what had happened at the Trebia. Livy has a different version of events. He depicts Longus boldly riding through the Carthaginian cavalry patrols in order to get to Rome and oversee the election. This is something that will be a recurring theme in this video. There are some major differences between what Polybius says and what Livy says when it comes to a lot of the details of the Second Punic War. By and large, Polybius is a better historian in terms of both intellectual history and also military history. Polybius had a great deal of military experience, Livy had none. But Livy is sometimes more interesting because he includes a lot of biographical details and also gets a lot of nuance about Roman politics and technicalities of Roman offices into his writing. So, for the most part, I preferred Polybius a little bit over Livy. That being said, I will point out where I'm getting each piece of information to make it clear. Also, I decided to follow Polybius's convention of calling these guys things like Geminus and Longus rather than Sempronius and Servilius. So if you're wondering why I'm calling people what I'm calling them, it's because of Polybius. Call him up and complain to him. Despite suffering setbacks at Ticinus and the Trebia, the Romans kept a stiff upper lip, and they more or less stuck with their strategy from 218. Scipio recovered from his wounds, and then he was named Proconsul. He went with his brother into Iberia in order to conduct operations against Hannibal's base. The idea here was to strike the Carthaginians in an area which was producing a lot of their manpower and wealth. Part of the plan probably was that if you put a lot of pressure on Iberia and start bringing tribes to heel, you will induce desertion from Hannibal's army in Italy. Many of the men there, of course, were recruited in Iberia. This doesn't end up happening, but if that was part of the plan, then I think that the thinking behind it was relatively solid. It just didn't end up panning out because the Romans underestimated Hannibal's charisma and ability to command loyalty. Also, I think that, to be fair, the main strategy of Rome at this time was to meet Hannibal and crush him on the field and end the war in one big battle. They were still very confident in the superiority of their infantry. Therefore, the two consuls, Geminus and his plebeian colleague Gaius Flaminius, each enrolled large armies in order to campaign in northern Italy against Hannibal. It would appear that both consuls were very much aware of and reacting to Hannibal's strategy to induce their allies to revolt. Therefore, they took up a fairly defensive posturing, covering their key territories and more or less letting Hannibal have the run of things in the newly subdued lands around the Po River. Geminus marched his army to Ariminum, which is on the Adriatic coast, in order to intercept Hannibal if he went east of the Apennines, whereas Flaminius covered Etruria from Iridium, which is not far from the Apennines. The idea was that they were close enough to coordinate operations, but separated enough to cover any paths into the heartlands of the Roman realm. Etruria was a rather rich place, and somewhere they didn't want him to be messing around, but they figured that it was possible he might opt to go in by the back door, the east of the Apennines, and that's why Geminus was there. So this was the disposition of Roman forces going into 217. Hannibal ended up choosing the west as his area of operations, and this meant that his opponent was Gaius Flaminius rather than Geminus. When Geminus learned that Flaminius was pursuing Hannibal seeking a decisive battle, he was eager to join in order to gain revenge for the previous year's defeats. However, he found that on a practical level it was very difficult to get through the Apennines. There are limited passages, and he had a fairly large army. So knowing that he wouldn't arrive in time to make a difference, he instead decided to dispatch 4,000 cavalry under one of his officers, Gaius Centenius. I'm not sure how many total horsemen he had, but this was a very significant portion of them. In the meantime, Hannibal met Flaminius at the Battle of Lake Trasimene and more or less destroyed Flaminius' army. Centenius was still on his way to try to find these two armies, and apparently none of the Roman survivors from Lake Trasimene encountered Centenius. However, Hannibal's scouts did, or perhaps some allies were defecting and wanted to get into Hannibal's good graces by giving him some intelligence. So Hannibal dispatched Maharbal and his Numidian cavalry in order to intercept Centenius. Maharbal took them by surprise, the Romans took refuge on a large hill, and the next day, finding themselves completely surrounded, they more or less all surrendered. So in many ways, this is more or less an addendum to the catastrophe at Lake Trasimene. Things ended up being even worse because of a well-intentioned gesture by Geminus. In the east, Geminus in the meanwhile had been fighting some minor battles against allies who had revolted, and he'd also managed to retake a couple of towns before he decided to march west after he received news of Lake Trasimene. Livy tells us the people that he subdued were Gauls, but I'm not entirely sure. At any rate, once he learned about Lake Trasimene and also Centenius, he realized that there was no major force between Hannibal and Rome, so he hurriedly began to march west. The Senate panicked after the Battle of Lake Trasimene, and they decided to appoint Fabius as dictator. In the next 6 months, he was authorized to do whatever he thought necessary in order to contain Hannibal and get Rome back on track towards a victory in this war. The reason why I put an asterisk on Fabius' dictatorship is because, according to Livy, Fabius was not a full-blown dictator, but rather a provisional dictator, because neither consul was available in Rome to officially appoint him to that office. The person who could have done so at the time was Geminus, but of course he was in the east, so that wasn't really an option. Fabius met Geminus at Narnia and took command of the army. Livy tells us that when the two men met, Fabius ordered Geminus to approach him without his consular lictors in order to reestablish the majesty of the long-dormant office of the dictatorship. And that becomes an even odder detail when we realize that technically Fabius was only serving as a provisional dictator, supposedly. Fabius, however, decided that Geminus should continue to be employed in some capacity, and he also appointed a new colleague to replace the fallen Flaminius, Marcus Attilius Regulus. So both men would be serving at Fabius' discretion for the next 6 months. We know, therefore, that for the vast majority of Fabius' 6 months as dictator, Geminus was at sea with a fleet of 120 vessels based out of Lilybaeum. What we don't know with much clarity is what he did and how well he did it. Polybius and Livy are completely contradictory when it comes to Geminus' tenure as fleet commander. Polybius is fairly dismissive of this whole period, and he clearly doesn't have much of an interest in it. He says that Geminus' activities were conducted competently enough, but that he mostly just shipped supplies to Scipio and fought a handful of skirmishes here and there, so he was never seriously tested. There's not much to talk about, according to Polybius. Livy, on the other hand, has a much fuller and more detailed account of what Geminus was up to during these months. He says that Geminus visited/threatened Corsica and Sardinia with his fleet and extracted hostages from both islands. Since both of these areas had been at one time colonized by the Carthaginians, this was a wise precaution, especially if Carthage itself would ever dispatch a fleet. Then you might see rebellions on Corsica and Sardinia. so taking hostages from noble families, presumably, was a fairly smart precaution, if true. There was another island near Africa where Geminus, instead of raiding it, communicated to the locals that if they were willing to pay 10 talents, he would pledge not to raid them. He got his money and had to do nothing to get it, so pretty good deal for him. That is an Athenian-style form of extortion. However, then he decided to proceed on to Africa itself, the Carthaginian heartland, and we have to presume that he landed in an area which was fairly far from Carthage but still full of Punic settlers. According to Livy, that landing went something like this. If Livy is correct, then Geminus handled his landing in Africa so poorly that he turned an easy opportunity for plunder into a near disaster. Wherever he landed in Africa, Geminus clearly thought that the enemy posed no threat. Rather than keeping his men in some form of discipline and making sure that they adhered to some unit cohesion and they remained in mutual support of one another, he instead allowed them to disperse into small units in order to maximize their plundering. The local defense forces were then able to ambush various small detachments of men, cause a rout of the Roman raiders, and force them to flee back to their ships, suffering 1,000 deaths, including that of a quaestor. Geminus then hurried his fleet back to Lilybaeum, where he handed it over to another magistrate, and then hastened back to the army in the field, because Fabius needed him there. When Fabius's tenure as dictator expired, Geminus and Regulus were on hand in order to take command as the consuls of Rome. They then proceeded to follow the Fabian strategy to the letter as consuls. They worked in perfect harmony, avoiding open battle while waylaying stragglers and foragers. Unlike Varro and Paulus, Geminus and Regulus also worked very well as a team. Even though they alternated command day by day, the army didn't really notice much of a difference because the two men were in sync. They were not a boy band to the best of my knowledge. Actually, Livy tells us that Regulus was pretty old, but maybe they were singing once in a while, who's to say? At any rate, combined with the success of Fabius and Minucius earlier in the year, these skirmishes had an effect which was fairly contradictory to what Fabius hoped to achieve. That is, that rather than convincing the Romans to avoid fighting with Hannibal and then going after his subordinates and going after other Carthaginian strongholds, instead, what these skirmishes and small victories did was to restore Rome's appetite for a decisive battlefield win, as they became convinced that the previous losses had been due to trickery on Hannibal's part and perhaps flukes here and there. Going into 216, Romans were feeling more confident, especially the Romans in the Senate. It would appear that Varro was very much in the majority of Romans who thought that they should go out and seek a major field battle in order to end the war as quickly as possible. Hannibal's strategy of inducing revolt among the allies was very costly, and it was something that Rome was very much afraid of. If they could corner him and defeat him, then his plan to create a large rebellion would fail completely. So, for most Romans, that was the more attractive strategy as compared with Fabius's strategy of attrition. And it appears that the Senate more or less ordered this to be the case, and therefore when Geminus and Regulus were both prorogued to be proconsuls in 216, it was understood that rather than being given small commands in order to harass Hannibal or his subordinates, they would instead be subordinate commanders in a huge army that was going to track down Hannibal and try to crush him with sheer numbers. The army they would end up having was up to 90,000 men, perhaps as low as 70,000, and it would contain a large number of senior commanders for the precise reason that this thing was huge and unprecedented. In Polybius' account, Regulus stayed the entire time, doing his duties as proconsul, and he shared in the command of the center at Cannae. However, Livy's account has him being dismissed early on in the campaign after he approached two consuls and told them that he was no longer fit to serve on account of his age. They, of course, allowed him to go back to Rome. Either way, it would make very little difference to what happened. Either he died at Cannae, or he was ill and he probably died within a few years anyway. So, makes very little difference. When the Romans tried to bait Hannibal by creating a secondary camp that would be smaller and closer to Hannibal, Geminus was the commander of the secondary camp. This was when they were trying to lure him out initially at Geranium, where Hannibal had spent the winter. However, part of the reason he didn't want to play is because he was running low on supplies, and he wanted to get the Romans comfortable there so he could march away and find some area that was full of new supplies. And that's exactly what he did, and how he ended up at Cannae, where there was a Roman supply depot. Prior to the Battle of Cannae and the War Council, where all of the magistrates would meet and debate, Livy says that the only two voices of caution were Geminus and Paulus. Of course, the guy who usually gets all the credit for being the hero of Cannae, the tragic Cassandra, is Paulus, but Geminus was there too. He just doesn't get any credit. So, take that for what it's worth. During the Battle of Cannae itself, Geminus had the distinction of being in command of the center. This was the part of the Roman army which was a densely packed infantry mass, so the exact amount of command he might have actually been able to exercise was probably rather modest. Varro led the allied cavalry on the left, Paulus commanded the Roman cavalry on the right. While the Roman cav might sound more prestigious, the allied cav was more numerous. So Varro actually held the place of honor, although technically the right was the place of honor. Geminus in the center was assisted ably by Minucius Rufus, the former master of horse under Fabius, who had won a couple of minor skirmishes with Hannibal before nearly being destroyed by him, and he possibly also had the old proconsul Regulus as well, and there were a number of other magistrates and former magistrates in the ranks. Arguably, Geminus' tactical role was the most crucial of all. If you think about it, neither Varro nor Paulus had a great chance of defeating the cavalry arrayed against them. Their job was to do as well as they could, while the center under Geminus crushed the Carthaginian infantry. If Geminus could steamroll the Carthaginian footmen, in that case, the cavalry battle would be reduced to insignificance. So, in many ways, you could say that the pressure was actually on Geminus to bring about a victory. It's also even possible that since he was given command of the center, and he was such a high-ranking commander to begin with, that the idea to concentrate and really funnel the men up in a hard mass was his idea rather than Varro or one of the other commanders. But most likely it was either Varro or Paulus who came up with the plan, since they were the reigning consuls. We all know what happened at Cannae, and we also know for sure that Geminus was among the 60 to 70,000 men who died, but there are three different accounts of precisely how Geminus met his fate. Before we get into the three different accounts of how Geminus met his end, I'd first like to talk about why there are such diverging accounts about this battle. You have to keep in mind, Cannae was traumatic, confusing, and bloody. For all the people who were there, it was horrible, and something that they would rather not have to reminisce about. Many of the survivors of the battle ended up not being ransomed, and most likely never had a chance to tell their story, and those were the men who had remained in the center until it had finally surrendered, exhausted. So they never got a chance to really go into detail about what happened on that day. And even if they had had a chance, that battle was extremely confusing. It lasted all day. People were exhausted. It was hot. It was dusty. People were crunched together. It would be unlikely that you would get a very clear sequence of events out of many of the people who got out of there. As for the other survivors, they had to cut their way out relatively early, so they weren't there in the closing minutes of the battle, or hours really. So, in terms of precise details, this is not the kind of battle you can reconstruct like, say, a Civil War battle, where you can go unit by unit, hour by hour, and know what's going on. We also have to keep in mind that a lot of our sources are very biased when it comes to trying to protect or condemn certain men, because they are either members of a family that is related to one of these guys, or else they have a patron who is a descendant of one of these guys. one person who very much is a beneficiary of having his family members really hype up his role is Lucius Aemilius Paulus, as we'll see. In Silius Italicus's epic poem Punica, Geminus was in the center, and then he was joined by Paulus after the cavalry on the right were defeated. Geminus, however, became battle fatigued because he'd been kicking so much ass that he just had to stop and take a break. Well, then the Lusitanian general Viriathus noticed that Geminus was tired, and he took advantage of that to come up and cut him down, and then he was singing a victory hymn when Paulus heroically got up and avenged his friend, only to be wounded by a slinger. In Polybius' account in Book 3, Chapter 116, he implies that while Paulus did join the fighting in the center and did his utmost to get into the thick of things, that Geminus and Regulus were still in command. He doesn't say directly whether Paulus took command or not, but things were already so confused that I don't know if there was anybody who you could say was in command in a reasonable sense. But if it had to be anybody, it would be Geminus or Geminus and Regulus. As for Livy, he simply tells us that Geminus commanded the center, and the center got destroyed. So, keeps things pretty simple, which is unusual for Livy. Livy's the guy who almost always elaborates with a lot of detail and then some judgments. So, this is uncharacteristic of Livy. But the hero of all three accounts, the guy that they really hold up as being the exemplar of Roman virtue and valor, is Lucius Aemilius Paulus. And that is largely because Lucius's son, Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, won an astonishing amount of wealth during his campaign in 168 against Macedon, and used a lot of it to hire people to write stuff about how great his dad was. One of the people that they took back as a hostage not long after that was the historian Polybius, who wrote the first major account of this battle, where once again Paulus was the hero and the wise man. And that then became the standard account. So, there you go. That's why Paulus is the hero, and Geminus was just some guy who was barely smart enough to just realize that Paulus was really smart. I hope that I've made clear that we don't know as much about Gnaeus Servilius Geminus as perhaps we should or could, because he didn't have a direct line of heirs who were really dedicated to preserving his memory and trying to bolster his importance in the historiography. Gnaeus Servilius Geminus was, so far as I can tell, a man of average abilities bearing a great name who was thrust into action against the most capable enemy Rome ever faced. In this way, he was very much a man of his generation. Just an average Roman aristocrat who was trying to take on one of history's greatest military geniuses, and he did so with a stiff upper lip. He did his duty, nothing more and nothing less. Polybius makes that fairly clear in his coverage of Geminus's naval campaign. He showed up, he did a few things, it was fine, but nothing spectacular. We also see that in Livy's account of his activities on the eastern coast of Italy. Won some really small actions, reduced a few towns, but nothing all that spectacular. He then pursued the Fabian strategy, and he did fine, but he didn't have any signal successes. Then at Cannae, he of course was part of a large-scale massacre, and that was not really his fault, but he was there as one of the senior guys, so he does deserve some of the blame. Given his family's high standing and longevity, it actually is pretty surprising that his descendants were not able to build up his reputation over time, especially when we think about his brother and his nephew who survived him. It's really unclear why they didn't choose to try to uphold his legacy in order to enhance their own. And his nephew, of course, as we mentioned, was an extremely accomplished man who served as consul, censor, and Pontifex Maximus. And since his own father hadn't really achieved as much, you might think that he would then try to talk about his uncle more, but it does not appear that he did. So, unfortunately, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus was more or less forgotten. He just became, and also ran, in the number of consuls who served during the Second Punic War. Next time, we will also do a consul who served during the Second Punic War, but I have not decided who that person will be yet.